The sounds of scraping trowels filled the air, echoing around the vast cave on the outskirts of Cairo. Clusters of archaeologists work methodically, their whispers blending in with the soft hiss of the shifting sand. Dr. Lena Marshall, head of the dig, crouched over a newly uncovered relic, a worn pot hidden in a shadowy alcove. Inside, rolled papyri lay stacked in disarray, each fragment inscribed with hieroglyphics. At first, the team dismissed the find as routine. The glyphs were little more than a record of long-forgotten pharaohs and mundane court proceedings. But then something caught their eye, something that didn't belong. It was a figure in the unmistakable royal headdress of a pharaoh, his hand gripping a strange object. Then it suddenly dawned on them it was unmistakable. An M16, its shape and design impossible for the era, and a pharaoh firing the weapon from his hip, Scarface style. Whispers filled the cave, disbelief hanging in the air. How could this be? Was it a mistake, a misinterpretation of ancient symbols, or something far more unthinkable? The answer lay hidden in the incredible tale of Sergeant Jake Dawson, a U.S. Army Ranger whose mysterious disappearance defied explanation. Lost to the modern world, his fate became the stuff of speculation until now. This is what would happen if one man, armed with only a single M16, ended up in ancient Egypt. Sergeant Jake Dawson stood in the center of a simulated combat zone in Kansas, the sun hanging low over the dusty earth. It was another routine exercise, an opportunity for his unit to hone their skills, a day-to-day task that didn't demand more than the usual grit and precision. The simulated assault was simple: move in, neutralize the opposition, and extract. Standard infill-exfil type stuff, nothing particularly out of the ordinary. But as Dawson crouched behind a vehicle, his finger resting lightly on the trigger, something shifted in the air. The temperature dropped as if the wind had changed direction in an instant. There was a strange hum, a subtle mechanical buzzing that pulsed through the ground, reverberating in his bones. His heartbeat, already rapid from the adrenaline of the drill, skipped a beat. The ground beneath him trembled, but not with the familiar shakes of artillery fire. No, this was something more unsettling, as though the earth itself had begun to buckle. For a moment, the world seemed to shift, twisting, warping, the horizon bending in unnatural angles. Dawson's training kicked in. He scanned the area for any signs of danger, but this wasn't an ambush or enemy artillery fire. It was something else. The air shimmered like heat waves rising off a desert floor, distorting everything in his line of sight. Then, without warning, the world seemed to fold inward. Time itself splintered. The ground disappeared from beneath him, replaced by an eerie, weightless sensation. The landscape around him vanished in a flash of blinding white light. His vision blurred, his pulse thundering in his ears as a hum intensified. With an abrupt jolt, the world snapped back into focus. He blinked against the oppressive brightness of the sun, squinting through the dust and the haze. The familiar rugged landscape of Kansas was gone. Instead, he found himself standing in a wide, barren desert. His faithful M16 was still resting in his hands, his combat gear intact, but nothing around him made any sense. The air was thick with heat, the smell of dust hung in the air. For the first time in his life, Dawson felt a chill, the weight of an unfamiliar world pressing down on him. This wasn't just a new place, he was somewhere else, somewhere far older. Dawson's combat boots sunk into the hot sand as he scanned the horizon, his heart racing. Rising in the distance, unmistakable against the harsh sky, were the colossal pyramids of Giza. The sight of them hit Dawson like a punch to the gut. He wasn't dreaming. This was ancient Egypt. The scene around him was surreal. Workers labored beneath the sun, hauling massive stones with simple tools, wooden sleds and ropes. Cattle carts creaked under the weight of heavy stones, driven by men in ragged linen. Ancient soldiers armed with spears and shields patrolled the area, their presence adding to the overwhelming sense of dislocation. His mind struggled to comprehend what his eyes were seeing. How had he gotten here? He slung his M16 over his shoulder, the weight of 8 loaded magazines pressing against his vest as the reality of his surroundings sank in. This wasn't a training exercise or a clever reenactment. This was real, impossibly, undeniably real. His first instinct was to keep a low profile. Dawson quickly surveyed the area. It was no use to make himself a target for any kind of confrontation. He needed to survive. The solution was simple, at least for the moment. Dawson found a cave hidden among some dunes, far enough from the worksite to avoid notice. He carefully unloaded the rifle and the 5 small crates of ammunition which had been sucked into the time vortex with him. He carefully tucked them beneath a pile of rocks and loose sand. The last thing he needed was to be discovered with the military gear of a future time. With that done, he wiped his brow and stepped back into the scorching sun. As he made his way back toward the village, a group of Egyptian soldiers spotted him. Their eyes narrowed at the sight of the foreigner and his strange modern clothes. They approached quickly, their weapons, bronze swords and short spears raised. Dawson's gut twisted. He could fight, but he'd be outnumbered, and with the rifle safely hidden in the cave, he was all out of options. Before he could react, they seized him, binding his hands with thick rope. The soldiers spoke in a harsh language Dawson couldn't understand, but their meaning was clear. He was a prisoner. Around him, the cacophony of labor echoed, grunts of exertion and the clatter of chisels against stone. He was thrust into the mass of workers as the overseers barked orders. Dawson's gaze lifted, and his breath caught in his throat. Towering above him was the grand vision of Pharaoh Khufu, a monument of impossible scale and ambition, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Dawson had little choice but to accept his fate. For the first time, he wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a man of modern times, he was a slave, digging in the dust and hauling stone under the brutal sun. But Dawson wasn't just trying to survive, he was studying, calculating, and observing. If he played his cards right, he would wield power in a way no one here could anticipate. In the weeks that followed his capture, Dawson's world shrank to the confines of the village and its surrounding worksite. His body was slowly being molded into the shape of a laborer, thin and malnourished. The relentless heat and grueling tasks were breaking him down, while the monotony of life in ancient Egypt set in. He spent his days lifting stones, digging trenches, and carrying massive blocks of limestone to the base of the pyramid. He made very few friends, mostly villagers who had no choice but to work alongside him. Communication was difficult, but Dawson learned quickly to speak with his hands and his eyes. He picked up simple gestures, crude signs that allowed him to convey his basic needs and, in turn, understand the people around him. Over time, his gestures became more refined and his understanding of the Egyptian tongue grew. Life was a cruel, repetitive cycle. Work site, work, home. But there was no escape from the suffocating daily grind. No hope for freedom. But Dawson's mind never stopped turning. He knew this world wasn't his. He wasn't meant to be here. He belonged in a different time, one where he'd been able to make something of himself, and one day he would make a life for himself in Egypt, too. That day came sooner than he expected. It began with a raid. Dawson had finished his shift, his muscles aching, his body drenched in sweat. When the first signs of trouble appeared, the sky darkened and a sense of unease spread through the village. The workers and the villagers fell silent, eyes darting nervously from one another. They had seen this before. Pharaoh's personal guards, the elite warriors who kept order in the kingdom, had arrived. This was no ordinary patrol. Dawson stood in the doorway of his hut, his senses heightened, his muscles tensing. He knew something was wrong. The guards were not here to collect taxes or oversee the work. They were here for punishment. The villagers might not have known it yet, but Dawson could sense a storm coming. The guards came in force, storming the village with ironclad boots and harsh shouts. The Pharaoh's elite soldiers were efficient and merciless. Dawson's friends, the ones who had taken him in, were among the first to be seized. Dawson's heart sank as the guards dragged them out, their arms bound in thick ropes. The villagers' pleading fell on deaf ears as Pharaoh's men lined them up in front of the village, their swords raised. Dawson could feel the tension building, a storm of violence that was about to break. The guards began to beat the villagers, their fists and weapons landing with brutal force. Dawson watched in horror as one by one his friends, his few true allies, were executed. The sound of their cries filled the air, their bodies dropping to the sand like discarded sacks. The cold-blooded murder of his comrades shattered Dawson's composure. His pulse quickened, the familiar rush of adrenaline flooding his system. His survival instincts, honed through years of combat and war, snapped into place. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He wasn't a slave. He was a fighter. Dawson's mind raced. He needed a plan, and fast. The guards were distracted by the bloodshed, their attention on the executions. Dawson knew this was his chance. In a blur of motion, he darted between the nearby huts. He heard the crack of a whip and the cries of a villager, but Dawson never looked back. His eyes were fixed on one thing: escape. He reached the edge of the village and sprinted toward the dunes, his legs burning as he pushed through the desert heat. The guards' voices faded behind him, but their pursuit was inevitable. In the distance, he saw the caves where he had hidden his rifle. It was a long shot, but it was his only chance. His mind worked quickly, calculating the risk. He couldn't carry everything, just the rifle and enough ammo to make a statement. By the time he reached the cave, the first guards were close on his heels. Dawson didn't hesitate. He grabbed the M16, slung the ammo over his shoulder, and started moving west, toward the heart of Egypt, toward the Pharaoh himself. This was no longer about survival, it was about vengeance, and Dawson had a weapon of unimaginable power to make sure Pharaoh's reign would come to an end. In the burning desert of ancient Egypt, where bronze swords and wooden shields were the weapons of choice, Sergeant Jake Dawson stood with an M16 rifle slung over his shoulder. It was a weapon that could change the course of history in a way no one, not even Dawson, fully understood yet. The M16 was a weapon built for efficiency, speed, and precision, invented some 4,500 years in the future and weighing just under 9 pounds fully loaded. It was lightweight compared to the cumbersome bronze weaponry of the Egyptians, but its true strength lay in the ammunition it fired. The 5.56 by 45mm NATO cartridge, a fast, light round designed to tear through human flesh with terrifying speed. At a muzzle velocity of 3,200 feet per second, the bullet didn't just penetrate the body, it fragmented, causing internal damage that could be catastrophic, shredding tissue, bone, and vital organs in an instant. The rifle could fire 700 to 950 rounds per minute, depending on the setting, and in the heat of battle, this rate of fire would be devastating. While the Egyptians struggled to close the distance with crude spears and shields, Dawson would be able to engage targets from a safe range, 1,500 feet or more, without ever needing to leave cover. The M16's minimal recoil allowed Dawson to control the weapon with ease, laying down a deadly wall of fire in seconds. In the hands of a skilled marksman like Dawson, it would decimate entire groups of soldiers before they had a chance to react. The Egyptians, armed with their rudimentary weapons, stood no chance. This weapon would make him a god among men, able to strike from afar, untraceable and unstoppable. As he stared across the desert, his mind raced with possibilities. The ancient world was about to face a reckoning that would begin with the roar of his rifle. The Great Pyramid gleamed in the midday sun, its white limestone casing catching the light and radiating brilliance across the desert. Thousands of laborers toiled in coordinated chaos, overseen by guards in polished bronze and the imperious gaze of Pharaoh Khafre himself, clad in ceremonial gold and seated on a high dais. The pharaoh was flanked by his elite guard, their weapons at ready, their eyes scanning the restless crowd. Dawson watched from the shade of a nearby bridge, his heart pounding as he reviewed his plan. Months of survival, of blending in and learning the lay of the land, had led to this moment. His ranger training had taught him to exploit opportunities, and this was as good as it would ever get. The pharaoh's presence at the site meant most of his loyal guards would be gathered in one place, their attention focused on the restless workers, not a lone figure lurking in the distance. He steadied his breathing and checked his weapon. His M16 had seen better days, but it remained his lifeline. 8 magazines and months of meticulous care would ensure it performed. Each shot had to count, and he couldn't risk wasting a single round. The first crack of gunfire shattered the oppressive silence of the midday heat. One guard fell, then another. Dawson's discipline bursts tearing through their ranks with mechanical precision. The pharaoh's guards scrambled in disarray, their bronze shields and spears useless against the devastating speed and power of modern ballistics. Dawson's training took over, short controlled bursts to maximize efficiency, aiming center mass to neutralize each target without hesitation. Panic ripped through the crowd of laborers, their cries of confusion and terror rising like a wave. Was this a curse from the gods? Pinpointing the threat at last, the guards attempted to rally, their spears flying harmlessly short of Dawson's position. He shifted his aim, taking out the nearest threats with calm, practiced movements. The remaining soldiers faltered, and then one by one they fell. Finally, Dawson turned his sights on the pharaoh Khafre. The man stood frozen, his divine aura shattered in an instant. Dawson hesitated only briefly, then squeezed the trigger, images of his devastated village flashing through his mind. The bullet struck true, and Khafre crumpled to the ground, his gilded headdress toppling beside him. The silence that followed was deafening. The laborers stared, their minds attempting to comprehend what they witnessed. To them, Dawson's rifle was no mere weapon, it was the staff of Ra, a thunderous gift from the heavens. Slowly, the first man dropped to his knees, then another, until the entire crowd was bowing in reverence. Amun-Ra, one said. Horus, another murmured. Dawson's heart sank as he realized what they were thinking. He wasn't just a man to them, he was a god. The pharaoh's royal entourage, terrified and leaderless, approached cautiously. They begged for mercy, offering Dawson a place in their household, a status as Khafre's divine heir. Dawson, ever pragmatic, accepted. The irony wasn't lost on him, a modern-day Moses not leading his people out of Egypt, but into an era of his own design. Weeks turned into months as Dawson consolidated his rule. He used his newfound power to establish a cult, one centered around his divine weapon, and turned his attention to a critical challenge, creating a sustainable method to replicate his weapon's power. The M16 was devastating, but it was only one weapon, and his ammunition supply was finite. Drawing on his military knowledge and rudimentary understanding of metallurgy, he and his artisans experimented with all the materials available in ancient Egypt. Dawson eventually hit upon an extraordinary solution, using a specific type of copper alloy to manufacture bronze casings and even rudimentary M16 replicas. This bronze, an early precursor to the gunmetal used in cannons a millennia later, had the advantage of being non-sparking. ensuring safer handling of explosive compounds. The alloy's malleability allowed Dawson's craftsmen to shape it with greater precision than iron. Admittedly, the replicas were far from perfect. They were even prone to exploding if used too frequently. But Dawson saw a silver lining. Even failed weapons could be melted down and recycled, even if their users could not. These costly, dangerous firearms became the exclusive equipment of Dawson's personal guard, turning them into an elite force of unparalleled lethality. With these new weapons in hand, his inner circle became the most feared and effective soldiers in the ancient world, cementing his grip on power and his legacy as God King. For years, whispers of a looming invasion haunted the people of Egypt. Groups of shepherd kings, fierce nomadic warlords from the Caucasus Mountains, and predecessors to the Hyksos peoples had long eyed the fertile lands of the Nile with envious ambition. Dawson, now firmly entrenched as pharaoh, knew his consolidation of power and the mysterious almighty weapons he wielded had only escalated the stakes. Rival kings and invaders alike sought not only to dethrone him, but to seize the secrets of his new arsenal. When the scouts brought word of an approaching army, a massive force moving through the harsh desert toward Egypt, Dawson prepared for war. The shepherd kings, confident in their numbers and ferocity, pushed through the arid wastes with grim determination. Their soldiers were hardened warriors, accustomed to the brutal conditions of their homeland, and the ranks swelled with chariots, spearmen, and archers. Dawson's spies reported their approach through a narrow canyon leading to the Nile, a natural choke point that would become their undoing. Dawson moved quickly, deploying his forces to the high cliffs flanking the canyon. Armed with their bronze firearms and disciplined under his relentless training, his soldiers waited in the searing heat for the invaders to draw closer. Dawson himself oversaw the ambush, his M16 at the ready. As the enemy entered the canyon, their ranks tightening in the confined space, Dawson gave the signal. Thunder erupted from the cliffs as his soldiers unleashed a devastating volley of fire. The lead chariots disintegrated under the barrage, their drivers and horses collapsing in heaps. The invaders' spearmen, unprepared for such an assault, fell in droves, their shields useless against the strange, deadly projectiles. Panic spread through the Shepherd King's forces attempting to retreat, but the narrow confines of the canyon turned their orderly ranks into chaos. Dawson's forces pressed their advantage, raining fire from the cliffs with relentless precision. He himself picked off key targets with his M16, felling commanders and chariot leaders with lethal efficiency. The echoes of gunfire ricocheted through the canyon, a sound alien and terrifying to the Shepherd King's troops. Within hours, the invasion force was shattered. Survivors fled in terror, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The few who escaped carried tales of the God King of Egypt, whose wrath brought thunder and death from the heavens. The Shepherd Kings, once feared across the region, abandoned their ambitions of conquest, warning others of the insurmountable power that now protected Egypt. By carefully rationing his remaining ammunition and maintaining the original M16, Dawson ensured his dominance. He introduced new tactics, organized the laborers into a disciplined militia, and transformed Egypt into an impenetrable fortress. The wealth and stability he brought ushered in a golden age, unlike anything the world had ever seen. Dawson's Egypt didn't just survive, it thrived, its power stretching across the known world. But power never lasts forever. Dawson's grip on Egypt started slipping, his ammo ran low, and the people who once feared his weapons started figuring it out. One of them was Menkaure, Khafre's son, who had been watching, waiting, learning. When Dawson's guard was down, Menkaure made his move. He grabbed the M16 and turned it on its former owner. The same weapon that once made Dawson untouchable now sealed his fate. A crack of thunder, one final shot, and it was over. Just like that, the so-called God King was gone. With real Egyptian leadership back in charge, the kingdom thrived. Dawson's reign faded into legend, just another story lost to time. Millennia later, when an archaeological team stumbled upon a hidden cave near Cairo, they uncovered artifacts that defied explanation. Among the treasures were crude bronze rifles, hieroglyphics depicting a figure wielding a weapon of thunder, and the preserved remains of an American male buried with full royal honors. The discovery sent shockwaves throughout the world. They had uncovered the story of a foreigner who briefly held power in ancient Egypt, a man who altered history with a weapon from the future. What would happen if an M16 showed up in ancient Egypt? Would it make Pharaoh unstoppable or spark chaos? Drop your wildest theories in the comments. Now go check out what if a single modern aircraft carrier traveled back to 1941 Pearl Harbor, or check out this video instead.